Good afternoon. We're back with another episode of the Lord of the Rings LCG Progression Series. And today is a card review of Mount Gundabad, which is the second to last quest of the Arid Mithrin cycle, second to last adventure pack of the Arid Mithrin cycle. Number 5. So let's take a look. We got a new version of Bilbo Baggins. Haven't seen Bilbo Baggins since the Hunt for Gollum. At least in terms of a player card. We've seen a player card hero. We've seen an ally version of him, which was pretty good. The other hero version of him I enjoyed, but quickly fell off due to his low health. Let's take a look at this version. We got 9 threat, 1/1/2, 2 health. After Bilbo Baggins commits to the quest, choose an enemy in the staging area. Until the end of the phase, Bilbo gets plus X willpower, where X is that enemy's threat. If the player's quest successfully deal 1 damage to that enemy, 2 if it's guarding a card. Interesting. So you can't use this ability unless there actually is an enemy in the staging area after Bilbo commits to the quest, which would be before staging. Most of the time you don't want to leave any enemies in the staging area. You certainly wouldn't want to if the only bonus was plus 2 willpower or plus 3 willpower. There's a lot of quests where an enemy stays in the staging area by design. In those quests, so let's say that's his primary usage, or perhaps you are using him in a deck that's designed to leave an enemy in a staging area for whatever reason. There's a few cards that make sense, although they're not elite cards. But let's say Bilbo's primary usage is against a quest where there's an enemy in the staging area all the time. How many threat would that enemy need to have before Bilbo would be good? Probably at least 3. If against a quest where there's a 3 threat enemy in staging all the time, and you can deal 1 damage to it when you're questing successfully, a lot of times those enemies are immune to player card effects or damage. But you could deal 1 damage to another enemy. This is an odd card for me. And the reason I say it's odd is because it is only good. Well, I mean, you're typically only going to run 1 tactics hero if you need a tactics hero, right? I almost never run 2 tactics heroes in true solo, and the reason is because tactics is so light on willpower. And willpower is such a heavy requirement in true solo. It's one of the 2 primary defensive stats along with shields, but it's the more important of the 2. Because it limits the enemies that are going to engage with you and allows you to clear out locations from the active location, make progress on quests, which allows you to keep threat down, which means you don't threat out. Because you got to think about the survivability of your heroes, and stabilizing the board, you have to think about your heroes surviving and not taking on so much threat that you lose the game due to arriving at 50 threat. So, willpower is the most important stat in the game, in my opinion, with defense coming second. And tactics is very light on willpower, and so I don't almost never run 2 tactics heroes. And if I was going to run 1 tactics hero, it would most often be either Eowyn for her 4 willpower and her insane attack ability, or Baragond for his really strong defensive ability. As I said, willpower and defense are number 1 and 2. And if I run a tactics hero, it's for one of those 2, typically, depending on what the situation calls for. Now, is Bilbo strong enough to take over either of those roles? I mean, he's not going to be your defender. In terms of your quester, he could only match Eowyn if he had a 3 threat enemy in the staging area every round. And then he wouldn't have Eowyn's plus 10 damage once a game. He would deal 1 damage to an enemy maybe every turn, maybe 6 or 7 times if if there was an enemy on the table that you could damage 6 or 7 times, which is unlikely, there's just no way Bilbo can provide as much value as either Eowyn or Baragon does. Which means he only makes sense when you want a tactics hero. Because Bilbo doesn't provide anything that either of those champions don't provide except direct damage. And then only when there's an enemy on the table. During the commit characters to the quest part of the quest phase, that can take damage from player cards. And that isn't very often unless you've designed your deck that way, because usually you want to clear the board every round if you can. So, what is Bilbo's role exactly? If it's just if all he brings to the table that's unique is a direct damage ability, which isn't useful all the time, and it's only 1 direct damage, or 2 if it's guarding a card, I suppose his role is against some seems like a very specific quest that he's designed to beat, and maybe it's the Mount Gundabad quest. I haven't looked at it yet. It's very possible. But he's certainly not going to be very good in very many quests. Not a majority, certainly. It's going to be a small minority of quests where that are his niche. And in other situations, you're going to want Eowyn or Baragon. Unless you're playing all tactics, in which case he's still pretty niche because of his low survivability and his inability to quest for much at all if there isn't an enemy in the staging area. So I think this card seems designed to solve a specific problem that I don't know that I've encountered yet. I'll keep an eye on it. I'll keep an eye out for that problem and keep this card in mind in case it should occur, but otherwise, outside of solving that problem, like a quest where there's a 2 or 3 threat enemy in the staging area all the time and there's a few guarded cards, that might be a situation where Bilbo makes sense. But outside of that, I don't see myself playing him. And even in that situation, I think it likely that Eowyn or Baragon would still provide more value. Greenwood Defender, 3 cost, 0/0/0, 2 shields, 0/0/2, 3 health. 3 cost, 0/0/2, 3 health. After Greenwood Defender enters play, it does not exhaust to defend until the end of the round. It's a Sylvan. I mean, that's okay. We've seen cards like this before that have action advantage on a relatively low statted defender, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because typically with a 2 defense defender, you're going to defend like 1, maybe 2 attacks, depending on how lucky you are with the shadow card, and then you're done defending. A Greenwood Defender only needs to get 2 defenses because to use it optimally, because that's all it can do. And then since it's a Sylvan, it might get cycled back into your hand to use the ability again. I find this card a little bit understated for what it does, and that's probably because it's off sphere. I don't think I would run it in a Sylvan deck, just for its defense. We've got Thranduil for defense. I'd rather put action advantage on him if I needed more. Or buff him with shields, cards, and things like that. That'd be my preference for further defense in a Sylvan deck over playing Greenwood Defender. Elf Guide, 0 cost, return a Sylvan ally you control to your hand to choose a hero. Add 1 resource to that hero's pool. Well, in the adventure pack with Thranduil, I talked extensively about the strengths and weaknesses of the Sylvan deck, and one of them that I mentioned was it lacks any kind of specific resource generation. And here comes this card, so apparently the developers were aware of that weakness. And this card does compensate for it. I like it for a Sylvan deck. I would run it, for sure. Now, it doesn't elevate them to elite status because anytime you need an additional card to fulfill an essential role, you're going to be a little bit weaker than a deck where the essential role can be filled with no additional cards. For example, a 2-card combo, a hero and an attachment that draws cards, is inferior to Aristor, who draws cards without any attachments. because using attachments or events to fulfill a role is going to be inconsistent because you have to rely on drawing the card when you need it. So I don't think this elevates Sylvans to elite status, but this does help it for sure. Helps cover one of their deficiencies that we talked about in the Thranduil card review. So I'm glad that card exists. Gaffer Gamgee, 2 cost 1101. Return Gaffer Gamgee to your hand to choose an enemy with engagement cost higher than your threat. Until the end of the round, that enemy cannot attack you. So it's a feint built into a 1 cost 1101. That is reusable. Very interesting. I think that's a good card, not for every deck. But I think that's a good card. I like it. A feint built into a 1101. It's costed appropriately, since feint costs 1 and is a separate card. Now it's only usable on enemies with engagement cost higher than your threat, so it is somewhat limited. More limited than feint, but reusable. I like this card. Not for every deck. Certainly not for higher threat decks. But for lower threat decks, yeah. I think I would include this card in lower threat decks. For sure. Almost every lower threat deck. Drinking Song. 0 cost. Count the number of cards in your hand and shuffle your hand into your deck. Then draw an equal number of cards. Draw 1 additional card if you control a unique Hobbit character. That's interesting. So that solves a specific problem, and that problem is a hand full of cards that aren't useful. Which happens a lot in decks that play unique cards. It doesn't usually happen early in the game. But it can. It could essentially be spend a card to get another mulligan. The draw 1 additional card if you control a unique Hobbit character is nice. I don't think it's necessary to make this card good. I see a wide variety of uses for this. It helps you to build decks that really rely on 1 card, because if you don't draw that card but you do draw Drinking Song, you could just mulligan for it right away, essentially. It's a built-in mulligan. It's insurance against a handful of unique cards or non-useful cards. Although in the late game, if your hand's full of unique cards, it's very possible you don't have anything in your deck that's useful either, depending on the deck. However, I like this card. I don't think you play 3 of them in most decks, but if you have access to lore, I think 1 of them or 2 of them in decks that are combo decks that rely on specific cards. I'm thinking off the top of my head of the Vilya deck. I think this would be a good card in that deck, but not a 3 of, probably a 1 of, or a 2 of, because you wouldn't want to, use this card and draw another one. It wouldn't be very helpful, typically, or you wouldn't want to have, 2 or 3 of these in your opening hand, although I suppose it wouldn't matter too much. I don't know, maybe you do play 3 of it, but my instinct is to go for 1 of it. One card slot on this, I think, would be a good use of that card slot. It would help with a problem that you see quite often, which is 2 problems really: not drawing a specific card you need when you need it, and having a hand full of unique cards or cards that aren't useful. So this is a great card. This may be the best card of the adventure pack. Well, that's not a very high bar, but yeah, this is the best card of the adventure pack so far, though I do like Gaffer Gamgee, but the limitation of only being good in a low threat deck. Drinking Song is more widely useful. I like that card a lot. And I think I would run it in a wide variety of decks, possibly even in a 1 deck, in order to solve the problem of too many unique cards in hand. Currently in the Elrond Villia deck, I'm running Darren's Runes to try to combat that because you can draw 2 and then discard a unique card. I may swap that out for Drinking Song. I like this card. Sting. It's a guarded objective, or guarded player card. Only guarded by enemy. Attached to a Hobbit hero. Restricted. Attached hero gets +1/+1/+1. After attached hero is declared as an attacker or defender against an enemy, deal 1 damage to that enemy. Well, unfortunately, I'm giving my speech again about the guarded player cards. Almost never in true solo do you want an additional enemy coming out of the deck to the staging area. Because usually the top priority in a solo game is to stabilize the board against whatever you started with in the staging area, or it came out on turn 1. And that's often very, very difficult to do against a lot of quests, and so adding an additional enemy that you have to defeat, even though it's a good attachment once you get it, but adding an additional enemy that you need to beat in the early game in solo play isn't usually something that a deck can handle. Well, at least not against the really tough quests. You can often do it when you stabilize the board. However, at that point you typically don't need strong cards anymore because you've already stabilized the board. And the quest's outcome isn't really in question. You're going to win at that point once you've stabilized and you're on your way. And therefore the guarded objective or the guarded player card isn't really necessary anymore. But I like it for its theming. And I think it's strong when you do get it under your control. And perhaps Bilbo Baggins is intended to help you with this problem, which the developers seem to have noticed. So they have 2 cards, at least in this expansion now, that seem to be designed to solve problems. Elf Guide solving a problem of the Sylvan deck, and Bilbo Baggins solving a problem with the guarded cards, which is that up to this point they haven't really seemed worth it for their downside. But if Bilbo can help you deal with that, Sting would bring out an enemy, which Bilbo can benefit from by getting his plus willpower bonus, and he can deal 2 damage to that enemy, which helps you to clear the guarded objectives. So perhaps Bilbo is intended to help you build a low threat deck with a variety of guarded objectives and use Bilbo or other staging attacks to clear out the enemies guarding the player card guarded objectives and claim them, and then go on to victory that way. And if that's the case, that's an interesting idea. I don't think it'll be an elite idea, but I do think it's a fun idea. So as a fun thematic deck, the low threat, attack the staging area, play guarded player cards, yeah. I like the idea as a fun deck. I don't think it'll be elite, but I think it'll be fun. Round Shield, 0 cost, attached to a character, restricted. After a shadow effect is triggered during combat, exhaust Round Shield to give attached character +2 shields for this attack. That is phenomenal. That's one of the best defensive cards in the game. Put that on a 3 shield character, have him take an attack for 3 and even an attack for 4, and if a shadow card comes out, boost his attack. With a shadow effect comes out, you boost his attack by 2. That's a really, really good card. And the fact that it can go on any character with no restrictions. I think in the book, Eowyn had a small round shield. I think that's Eowyn in the picture. But it's not limited to Rohan or Warrior or anything else. It's no restrictions, 0 cost. This is a really, really strong defensive card. We've now seen 2 really strong 0 cost cards in this adventure pack, Drinking Song and Round Shield. This may even be my go-to card for shields when I'm determined that I need an attachment to boost shields in a deck. This is really strong. The fact that it isn't always going to work, I don't think matters as much, because you can plan. It helps you plan for what you don't know. What you do know you can plan for, and this card helps you plan for what you don't know, which is what the shadow effect is going to be. I think it's very, very strong, and will likely be my go-to card for shielding at 0 cost when I have access to tactics. Very, very good card. This card and Drinking Song may even make this adventure pack a recommended buy for players who are looking to defeat the hardest quests in the game, because I think those 2 cards are going to be important in very, very strong decks. Though it doesn't feel that great to buy an adventure pack just for a song and a shield, right? Typically, if you're going to buy an adventure pack, you want the hero to be really strong, and if not a hero, then a really cool ally or something. It doesn't feel very good to buy adventure packs just for the support items, but sometimes that's what you got to do if you're trying to build a deck that's comparable to the best decks in the game when you're going for the Nightmare quests. Erebor Toymaker, 3 cost 2002. After you play Erebor Toymaker from your hand, reduce the cost of the next attachment played this phase by 2. Well, if you got an attachment to play for 2 or more, that would reduce the cost of this card down to 1 for 2 willpower and 002. That's great. Actually, it seems pretty good in the Dale deck for a little Dwarf Dale synergy. And I think this quote from the Fellowship of the Ring, there were toys the like of which they had never seen before, all beautiful and some obviously magical. That's referring to the Dwarven toy makers. With Erebor being very close to Dale. This makes sense to me a lot in the Dale deck because of the high amount of attachments played in that deck. Without the attachment available to play in combination with this, it's still not terrible. It's not terrible. It's really, really good if you play an attachment with it. It's not terrible if you can't. It's going to sit in your hand sometimes as you wait for the optimal situation to play it. If you're like me, I tend to get pretty greedy with cards like this and let it just sit there for turn after turn while I wait for the attachment to come. But I think this card is pretty good when you got a lot of attachments to play. Not so good that I would... it kind of falls off in the late game, right? So a lot of... some of my Elrond Villia decks have played a bunch of attachments. I don't think I'd play Erebor Toymaker in that deck because I wouldn't be too happy when this came out with Villia. I'd rather have another higher statted card. So its problem is it kind of falls off in the late game. It's best early. It's best in cards that need to get off to a fast start and kind of struggle with cost reduction or generating resources. So I don't think it goes in every deck, certainly, or every deck with attachments to pay for. But in some decks it could be good. It could be very helpful for... So I think this card is intended to solve a problem as well, along with Elf Guide and Drinking Song. And the problem this is intended to solve is in the Dale deck with getting off to a quick start, because the Dale deck is pretty slow. And this cost reduction card can help with that. Armor of Erebor. Attached to a Dale character, Dale or Dwarf character, restricted attached character gets +1 shields and gains Sentinel. Sentinel's useless in solo, so +1 shields for 2 cost is terrible. Don't see a use for this in solo. Would not run it in any situation that I can imagine in solo play. Yeah, the Hauberk of Mail gives you +1 shields for 1 cost, and I don't think you'd play both. I don't know, it's possible, but that you'd want additional armor beyond that, but this 2 cost for 1 armor is not good in solo. It could be useful in multiplayer for like a big, I'm thinking of like Diane that would probably make sense for him in multiplayer, so that you could make use of his shields against attacks from against other players, because he is a tactics or a spirit hero, and so you might want to use this card to have Diane help out your tactics player. But in solo, this is a bad card. The Shire Folk. 0 cost, play only if each of your heroes is a hobbit, reduce your threat by 4. Well, if each of your heroes is a hobbit, I would run this card for sure. 4 reduction for 0 cost and 1 card is quite good. I would definitely run this card if every one of my heroes is a hobbit. As of right now, the deck where all of the heroes are hobbits is a fun deck, but not a very good one. But in that fun deck, this is a good card. So, is the expansion worth buying for Drinking Song? Or is the adventure pack worth buying for Drinking Song and Round Shield and maybe Erebor Toymaker and maybe Elf Guide? Well, your mileage will vary. If you like Sylvans and Dale or something like that, or fun decks in general like Hobbits, guarded cards, that kind of fun thing, then yeah. If you're a really hardcore player that's really dedicated to finding the best decks available, I do think Round Shield's got a place in really, really strong decks. And possibly Drinking Song as well. So, doesn't feel very good to buy an adventure pack just for those, but I probably would, personally. Your mileage may vary. The other cards, they're fun cards, fun thematic cards, and nothing wrong with that. I like every card game I've ever played has fun themed decks, and that's great. I play those kinds of decks myself from time to time and enjoy them. But it does affect the recommendation for the adventure pack, because not every player is into fun thematic decks. Anyway, thanks for watching.